thank you very much for the invitation to spend a week in the Arts and Humanities part of this university. It's a pleasure and it's a great honour to have been invited. And I've enjoyed my time so far, and I'm hoping to carry on enjoying it even during and after this lecture. Thank you very much. What I wanted to say was that when I was planning this lecture, I was thinking of it as primarily a lecture for people who are not themselves professional philosophers, as a lecture for people who might be interested in philosophy, who want some things, issues in philosophy to be explained, laid before them. So it's not going to be technical, pushing back the boundaries of the subject. It's going to be kind of drawing you into a kind of a dispute and some reflections on the dispute. Okay, so one might say the professional philosophers in the audience might be bored, but I hope that the non-professional philosophers might be interested. Thank you very much. Well, the title, I'm not sure which way round it's advertised as. Philosophy and Selves, or Selves and Philosophy. It's the same thing. Selves, in this usage, is just the plural of self. Okay. The term self, as a noun, isn't a term that we use ourselves a lot in talking about ourselves. So I wouldn't say, if someone said, what can you see? I would say, I can see a lot of people, a lot of persons. I wouldn't say I can see a lot of selves. Okay. And if someone said to me, what are you? I might say, well, I'm a person, or I'm a human being. I wouldn't say, oh, I'm a self. However, in philosophical usage, I take it that the word self, the noun self, is intended to be a noun that applies to each of us. Each of us is a self. We are selves, and each of us is a self. And so when we're thinking about the nature of selves, what we're fundamentally thinking about, it seems to me, is what the nature is that we ourselves have. Okay. So the problem of what a self is simply another term for the problem, what are we? What kind of things are we? What nature do all the people who are sitting in this room share? That could be reformulated as the problem of selves. Okay. And if I'm right in thinking that the problem of selves is a problem about what we are, you can put the same question in the following way, using the first person pronoun. What are selves could be put in by me as, what kind of thing am I? What kind of thing am I? Or if we're doing it collectively, what kind of things are we? The totality of people here listening to this lecture. Okay. And what that implies is that one sort of anchor on discussing this question is that we're trying to work out, when we're thinking about the nature of selves, what the reference of the word I is when we use it to pick out ourselves. So, since you are a self for the purposes of this discussion, okay, the question, what are you, is the question, what is a self? Or the question, what am I, is the question, what is a self? And so we can anchor our kind of arguments and debates by remembering that we're talking about ourselves. The question is, what kind of things are we? Now, that's by way of introduction to the issue. And I think I just want to remark that this particular problem, what kind of nature do we have, is clearly a problem which grips many people. They want to know about themselves, what kind of nature they have. And it's a problem which has gripped philosophers, reflective people for millennia. And so we're not short of answers to this question. Philosophy provides many answers to the question, what kind of things are we? And in this lecture, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to argue, but in a very selective way, that the philosophical tradition hasn't thrown up very good answers to the question, what are we? And I'm going to argue that by looking at two answers to that question by two philosophers. And I'm going to suggest to you, without adding any support to this, that basically they're typical in their accuracy of what philosophers have achieved. And the two philosophers I'm going to talk about are Descartes and Hume. Then I'm going to, having got to a certain stage, try to introduce and argue for the answer to the question which I myself favour, which is that we are fundamentally and basically just animals and should think of ourselves that way. That is the kind of nature that we have, a view which I call animalism. Now, in a lecture like this, I can only scratch is the word I'm looking for, only scratch the surface of that very complicated debate. But I'll try to make a few remarks to make the view I want attractive, but certainly I won't achieve anything like conclusive support for it. Okay. And then I'm just going to finally get to death, the subject of death, that is, and try to link the account of the self that I'm proposing with one sort of issue that's currently being raised about death. That will be very, very brief. So, two views I want to reject will be, first of all, described and analysed. Then animalism will be set up and argued for to some extent. And finally, one implication for death and how to think about death from animalism will be laid out. And then that will complete my kind of account of this particular problem. Okay, so let me start then. I mean, the view I have is that the answers that philosophers have tended to give to the question, what kind of things are we, are implausible and shouldn't be believed, right? Philosophers tend, it seems to me, to get hold of the wrong end of sticks for very deep and interesting reasons, but they do. And so I'm going to start with Descartes as one specimen philosopher and look at what he said about the nature of selves and to put before you some criticisms of his type of view. Okay. What was Descartes' view? Well, here I'm going to sketch the Cartesian view in very crude terms, the terms that a kind of introductory courses in philosophy would use. Okay. Descartes' central idea, thinking about yourself, is that you have to recognize a distinction between yourself, that is to say, what that thing is which the word I is picking out when you use the word I, and your body, the thing that we can talk of as your body, right? Fundamentally, he is a dualist. He has a duality of basic types of thing. On the one side, you have the kind of thing which bodies are. They're material, spatial entities, things like tables, chairs, trees, and so on the one side. But in contrast to them, you yourself are a substance of a quite different kind. You are a non-material substance or ego with a different nature. You don't have a spatial extension You just exist in some other realm, in some other way. Okay. You're linked to your body on this picture causally. Your body is controlled by you, and so you can produce movements in your body, even though you aren't a physical thing. And changes in your body can produce things in you, like pain, or thoughts, or desires, and so on. So there's a two-way causal interaction between the physical thing which is your body and the thing which is you, the thing which is a non-spatial ego. Okay. Why did Descartes have this picture of himself? Why was that the correct account of his own nature, the nature that he thought he had? Well, I'm going to look at just two kinds of arguments that Descartes proposed. And the most important general point to make here is that what Descartes is wanting to establish is that you are one thing and your body is another thing. He's wanting to establish that. And although this isn't exhausted by the following claim is certainly part of what he's got to show, namely, your body and you are not the self-same thing. There is a non-identity between you and your body. There's a difference between you and your body. They are different things. Okay. So Descartes has at least got to produce arguments to convince you that you and your body are separate entities. Okay. There's a non-identity between you. How do philosophers, or in general, how do people show there's a non-identity between an entity A and an entity B? Well, the way to do that is to find some property that A has and that B lacks. Okay, so if there's a property that one of these things has but the other lacks, they cannot be the same thing, because if they are the same thing, there's just one thing, and for any property, that one thing either has it or it lacks it. It can't both be a thing which has the property but doesn't have the property. What I've just said is one way of formulating one of the principles that all philosophers accept, which will be called Leibniz's law, which is that if A and B are the self-same thing, then any property of A is a property of B and vice versa. Okay. So that law is a law which underpins arguments for non-identity between things we're talking about. You look for a property difference between the two things, and if you can persuade someone that there is such a thing, you can persuade them that there's a non-identity between the two objects. So what Descartes is trying to do is to come up with property differences between you and your body. Okay, what are the differences that struck him, that he was interested in? In the Meditations, Book 6, which is Descartes' most famous philosophical work, when he's discussing this question, and I'm kind of abbreviating at this point, he comes up with the following difference. He gets to a certain point in his argument where he says something like this. I am an essentially thinking thing. A property I have is that of being essentially a thinker. My body isn't essentially a thinking thing. It lacks that property, in which case I and my body cannot be the same thing, because they're property differences of over our essences. And when philosophers like Descartes are talking about essence, what they mean is features which the thing in question must have in order to exist. Okay, so they're operating with a distinction between features which a thing can have and then lose. Those are non-essential properties that things have. And properties which a thing must have in order to remain in existence. And those are the properties which are essential to the thing in question. Okay, so what Descartes is claiming is that unless he remains a thinking thing, he cannot remain in existence. He cannot lose that property of being a thinking thing. On the other hand, his body can remain in existence even if it doesn't have the property of being a thinking thing, and therefore it isn't essential to it that it's a thinking thing. That's the contrast that he tries to exploit, or one of them, in his argument in the Sixth Meditation. Okay. Well, what should our reaction be? What is kind of the reaction that we should have to that type of argument, those candidate property differences? What's our reaction? Well, my reaction is this. It looks completely right for Descartes to say, my body isn't something which has to be a thinking thing in order to exist. He looks completely right to say, it's not an essential property of my body that it's a thinking thing. Why not? Well, something could mess around with my body and remove the occurrence of thought in it. You know, they just do nasty things to my brain, and it would no longer be a thing where thought was occurring. But it would still exist. It would still be this body, even though the power of thinking had been lost. Okay. So what he says about his body looks completely right. It isn't essential to his body to be a thinking thing. The problem with the argument is why Descartes has the conviction that it's an essential property of him that he's a thinking thing. Why does Descartes have the view that unless he's a thinking thing, he can't exist? Okay. Now, it is unclear quite what Descartes means by thinking thing. But the most straightforward way of interpreting him is being a thing which is thinking. So it's not just referring to a power of having thoughts, a capacity to think. It's requiring the occurrence of thinking at all times. So we're interpreting Descartes as claiming that he is something which can't exist unless he is thinking. Okay. Now, if that is what Descartes thought, it looks to be an opinion which is pretty wide of the mark, right? Because as the famous English philosopher Locke remarked, don't we all have periods of deep sleep when we're not thinking, right? We're just asleep. We're not engaged in thinking about anything. Nothing is going on which you would describe as thinking. Or again, if you happen to take part in a bout and get knocked out, there's a period where you're not thinking about anything. You're completely unconscious until you recover from the blow. That's how we think. I mean, that's how we think about ourselves. We exist through periods in which we don't think. So it doesn't look as if he's right to suppose that it's an essential property of ours that we think. Right? So we actually, as far as that's concerned, are like our bodies. There isn't a difference between us and our bodies over the necessity that we think. Like our bodies, we can have periods when we don't think and still remain in existence. Okay? So that candidate of a property difference between ourselves and our bodies, which Descartes was using to show you are not your body, that candidate example doesn't look as if it's persuasive. Because what he says about himself is just implausible. It's implausible. Though what he says about his body is correct, what he says about himself is implausible. But I want to look at a second argument that Descartes has in a different place, because I think it's a quite interesting argument. It's typically ingenious, and one can maybe understand why Descartes accepted the argument in the 17th century, though we're not likely to accept it today. Okay. What Descartes said, and this comes from his book, The Discourse on the Method, what impressed Descartes was this. He was thinking about us, ourselves, and what we can do. Okay. And one of the things that we can do, according to him, is make intelligent responses to conversations that we hear. So if someone says to you, where is the central library on this campus, everyone in this room can intelligently reply to that question and say, it's over there, or something like that. Okay, that's a capacity that we have. And secondly, what impressed Descartes was that if we're presented with problems, then we can work out a solution to them. We are capable of solving problems, and we're capable of responding intelligently to conversation. Okay. We have these kinds of capacities on the one side. But what about our bodies? What kind of capacities in that respect do our bodies have? Okay. Well, the thing that was fundamental about our bodies is that our bodies are just material objects. They are things made of matter, the responses and behavior of which are determined by the nature of the matter that you have there. Okay. So fundamentally, bodies respond in the way that matter can generate, that matter can produce. Okay. And Descartes thought that no purely material thing, no body, could do the two things he'd selected that we can do. That no body could understand remarks and respond to them intelligently in conversation, nor could bodies have the general problem-solving capacities that we have. Now, if he's right in this contrast between us and bodies, if that is right, then you can see that we cannot just be the body. We can't be the body because the body can't do what we can do. Okay, so if there are these contrasts that Descartes claimed there were between us and bodies, then we can't be identical and we have to be something else than the body. The logic is absolutely okay. The question is, are these premises correct? Are the two claims that he's making correct? Now, if Descartes were here, I think the question that we should put to him would be this: Descartes, how do you know what bodies are capable of? How do you know what a thing which is purely material can do? Now, clearly what was going on in the 17th century was that Descartes was surrounded by material things which could do certain kinds of things, like clocks, or certain kind of moving models which could chug along. Okay, that's what material constructs in the 17th century could do. Okay, but there was nothing that was material and made by humans which could mimic or come anywhere close to doing the intellectual things that we can do. So the contrast existed in the world that Descartes inhabited. Okay, but the question that Descartes should have thought about more deeply was, it's all very well to say material things I'm familiar with can't do this. The question is, could there be material things which could do this, right? Could there be material things which can do this? How do you know, Descartes, what material things are capable of? And I think actually Descartes himself would have no answer to that question. He really had no basis for being confident about what material things are capable of. And in fact, Descartes could perfectly, respectably have studied his argument on its head. He could have said, we are capable of understanding conversation and taking part in it. We are capable of problem solving. We're material things, apparently. So there must be some pretty amazing matter somewhere involved in us, right? We must be material things of a kind where these powers are conferred upon us by the matter that we are made of. Okay. That's as respectable an argument as the form that Descartes' argument took. Namely, we can't be material things because matter isn't capable of this. You could equally well argue there's some pretty amazing matter which must be capable of this. And of course, that would be the conclusion that he should have drawn, right? It would have been more prescient to conclude, well, we are composed of amazing matter, than that we're not composed of matter at all. Okay, so Descartes' dualism, where have I got to? Basically, I've claimed that the arguments that led Descartes to espouse some form of non-identity claim between you and your body, the type of arguments that moved him are not persuasive. In one case, he accepted a claim about himself, and I haven't gone into why he accepted that claim, but he accepted a claim which looked fairly incorrect, pretty incorrect. There's no contrast over essence. And in the second argument, he accepted a claim about limitations on what material things are capable of, which he had no ground for accepting. Right. So in both cases, the kind of Leibnizian argument which he was putting forward of a property difference, those arguments don't work. And the dualism that he wants is unsupported. Now, there might be other dualist arguments. There might be other arguments to use against Descartes' dualism. What I'm interested in is just trying to say it's unsupported. This kind of view is unsupported. Right. We shouldn't rush it out and believe it. So let's set that on its side. I'm going to just add one comment. This is slightly provocative. Viewed one way, Descartes is involved in a program which might be called entity detection or entity discovery. Okay. What entities is Descartes discovering? Well, he thinks he's discovering that there are certain entities which you and I are, which are non-material things, but which, in some broad sense, are entities in the world. In some broad sense, there are entities in the world. Descartes thinks he's laid his hands on grounds for supposing that there are entities of this sort. Right? He's hypothesizing the existence of certain entities. And one might say, as a philosopher. Now, I think when philosophers postulate entities as part of their theories, they're doing something which one should at least view with great skepticism. Okay? Because basically what are philosophers doing? Philosophers are just thinking about consequences of things that strike them. They start with certain data which they accept, things that they themselves feel they can be fairly confident of, and they're drawing conclusions on the basis of arguments, deriving them from the data that they've got. Now, it really does seem to me a bit amazing that philosophers think that they can move from the type of data that they can put their hands on to discovering the real existence of certain kinds of things that people in general don't recognize. Because you think, how could a philosopher do that? Scientists can do that because scientists investigate the real go of the world and look for what's actually happening, and their experiments force them into recognizing that there's some entity of a certain kind doing something at a certain stage in this process. It's much harder, when you think about it, to see how philosophers might locate an entity and convincingly show that it exists when they reflect on the things that they know about. So beware of that kind of thing, I want to say. Beware of philosophers who propose they've discovered an entity. Okay. Now I'm moving on to the second philosopher I want to talk about. And I'm going to try to do this very briefly, because I'm going to run out of time in a second. And that's Hume. Now, Hume's role in the whole debate is quite unlike Descartes. He was basically, this is how I'm going to interpret him. I've said that the question is, what kind of things are we? What is it that the first person picks out when we use it? Okay. And that's going to be what the self is, if we can find out. Hume's attitude is, actually, there is no such thing. The word I doesn't actually pick anything out at all. There are no selves. It's a kind of a myth to think that there is something that we are, right? So Hume represents a response to our question of rejecting the question and saying, actually, there are no selves. There really are no selves. It's a non-question. Your conviction that there is something that you are is itself a mistake. So he's a skeptic about this whole debate. Well, this is pretty extreme. This is pretty extreme. Completely the different side of the debate to Descartes. Why did Hume have this view? Well, I'm just going to look very, very briefly at 3 remarks he makes, which convinced him that basically the self is a myth. The self is a myth. Okay. Now, here's one argument that Hume has. It's a clever argument. If you are something, if there is something that you are with a certain nature, quite clearly, that thing must be where you are at all times, because it's you. So whatever you are doing in the world, moving around in the world, the thing which is you, yourself, has to be there. Okay? It has to be constantly around you, because it is you. And then he adds, I mean, that's quite correct. That so far is the correct consequence. Then he says, but actually, in my experience, there is no constant and invariable element. There is no constant and invariable element in my experience. But if there was a thing that was me, it has to be constant, because it is me. Therefore, there is no thing which is me. Okay. Well, that's clever, but it's mixed up, right? Because what Hume has overlooked is that although if there is a thing which is you, it always has to be where you are, right? It isn't necessarily a thing which doesn't change, right? In fact, you change. That's how we think of ourselves. We are things which change. So if there is something which is you, it's going to be a thing which changes. And therefore, it doesn't count against the existence of something which is you, that as far as you can tell, there is no invariable, constant, all the time the same thing where you are. It's a confusion to go from the thing that is me will be with me at all times, because that's what I am, to it must look and seem the same at all times. Because that overlooks the fact that the thing which is you can change. And that's indeed how we think of ourselves. Fortunately, as far as everyone in this room is concerned, we change. Okay? For good or ill. So that argument is unpersuasive. A second argument that Hume had, less convincing actually, is he says, if there is something that is you, right, then the experiences that you have, the thoughts that you have, the pains that you feel and so on, these things are going to depend in some way on the presence of that thing. That's the thing which has the experiences, that's you. And so without that thing, these experiences, which are your experiences, wouldn't occur. But as against that, Hume says, actually, all my experiences are independent and not dependent on anything else. How does he put it? They don't need anything to support their existence. He just says, my experiences are quite independent and don't need anything to support their existence. Now that claim, of course, is totally unjustified. How does Hume know what his experiences depend on in order to occur? He's got the conviction that they don't depend on anything, they just occur. But that's totally without justification. Maybe they are things which, for their existence, depend on something, namely the thing, whichever it is, which is you. So that argument really is just dogma. That's just a dogmatic argument. And finally, and this is one of Hume's very famous remarks, and I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. Hume says, really, in my experience of the world, in what I'm aware of, all I'm aware of are experiences I have. I'm never aware of myself. I'm never aware of myself. I never experience or perceive myself. Well, it's not entirely clear what would follow if that were true. But why did Hume want to say that? Because on the face of it, it's incredibly common to perceive yourself. Right? It's not a difficult achievement to perceive yourself. You can just sort of hold up your hand and you're seeing yourself. Or look down at your feet and you're seeing yourself. Or look in a mirror and you're seeing yourself. Or touch your head and you're feeling yourself. And so on, and you're hearing yourself. So on and so forth. The idea that the thing which is ours evades perception by us is just wrong, is just completely and utterly wrong. And in fact, the ways in which we perceive ourselves are complicated. I've just chosen the simple, obvious examples. But there are much more complicated ways in which we perceive or are aware of ourselves. And Hume's claim that we don't do that is quite incorrect. All right, so the Humean skeptical view is to be rejected. The Cartesian dualist view is unsupported. Where have we got to? Well, I think myself that a slightly artificial way of thinking, a slightly odd way of thinking, is the position we've got to at this stage, really. And that is, we have a kind of conception of ourselves which we've got no reason to be skeptical about. And that is that we are things which have a whole range of properties. So I have a body, I have a weight, I have a shape, right? I am doing certain kinds of things, and so on. So I can ascribe a lot of properties to myself. And there's no reason, when you're thinking about the kind of thing you are, for being skeptical or worried about possessing those properties. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, a thing which has these types of properties. Okay. Now, fundamentally, just concentrate on location. I'm located at this point, and you're all located at your separate points in this lecture room. Okay. Now, here's what I'm going to claim. And this is slightly strange, but it seems to be true. And that is that at the same location that you would think you were in, there actually is a human animal. An animal which belongs to a certain species. Okay? Which, like animals around us, is just a product of this incredible process of evolution. And it's something which has emerged in that chain of events producing the animals around us. So that where you are, there is a human animal, an animal of a certain kind. Okay. The strange thing is to maintain at this point a possible conceptual distinction between yourself and the animal. But in order to get the problem, face up to the problem at this stage, we've got to do that. Okay. So we then get to the basic question, the basic choice point, it seems to me at this stage in the debate, is should we assert an identity between ourselves and the animal which is co-located where we are, which is in the same location, or not? That's the fundamental question that we've got. And depending on how you answer that, that will determine how you start thinking about yourself. Because basically, if you think that the answer is there is an identity between you and the animal where you are, if you think that, then in a sense you have homed in on a kind of a natural thing which is yourself. That is what you are. You are that kind of animal. On the other hand, if you think there isn't an identity, then you're looking for a different answer to the question. A slightly different answer to the question. And we've already encountered the methodology for thinking about this type of question when we were talking about Descartes. I mean, if you remember, Descartes was trying to prove that he himself and his body were non-identical. And in order to prove that, he searched for candidate differences between himself and his body. Well, the question now is, can we come up with differences between ourselves, given our rich conception of ourselves that we have, and the animal that's in the same location that we're in? Can we come up with differences at that point? And, and basically, having raised that question, that catapults us into an enormous debate in current philosophy about the nature of ourselves and about the nature of persons, which I'm afraid I simply can't go into because it is too rich and too complicated, and in many ways very difficult. Okay, but let me just hint at the kind of property differences that impress some people who will have followed the argument absolutely happily up to this point. Okay. Are the existence conditions, or remaining in existence conditions, persistence conditions, that you have the same as the ones that the animal sitting where you are has? Are they the same? Are there circumstances where it might be correct to say the animal remains, but you have gone. Or situations where something can happen to you, at the end of which we could say you remain, but no longer have the animal. Because if your histories can come apart, in principle, then it doesn't look as if you can just be that self-same thing, the animal. Okay. So the candidate examples for these dissociations, which people think exist, would be where you, let's put it this way, where you develop incredibly severe dementia and lose, let's say, lose all powers of thought, reason, and get to that stage where you've lost consciousness as well. Okay, you're alive, you're remaining there. Sorry, I don't want to say that. That's begging the question. I want to say there's an animal which is clearly still alive, breathing, but are you, the self, the subject, still there or not? That's one potential dissociation between you and the animal. That's one kind of case. Another kind of case, which is the other side, would be, suppose we took out your brain with keeping it functioning, that's to say keeping consciousness and memories and beliefs, etc., and transported it over to some other receptacle, and left your body behind. On the face of it, the body is what remains of the animal, but on the other side, over there, a lot of people think that's where you've gone. You yourself have gone over there with the brain. In which case, that's another possible dissociation between you and the animal where you happen to be now. Okay, so a lot of the debate is, are these dissociation cases genuinely, correctly described? Have they been described properly? Well, and that's very difficult. That is very, very difficult to know. What I'm going to do, though, is sketch three little arguments on the other side, which are trying to put some pressure on you to look more favorably on the idea that you are the animal which is co-located with you, which is in the same place that you're in, that's what you are. These may be spurious arguments, or they may be they may have a grain of plausibility in them. But let me put them to you. The first one is this. The question we're discussing, I can formulate in the following words. Am I the animal that's here? Am I the animal that's here or not? Okay, that's the question. But who posed that question? Who posed the question? Who spoke the words, am I an animal? Well, the answer is, they were certainly spoken by the animal that's here, right? The animal that's here spoke the words, am I an animal? Now, if something which is an animal asks the question, am I an animal? The only answer is yes, because the animal is referring to itself and asking whether it's an animal, and since it is an animal, ex hypothesi, the answer to that question is yes. So, the answer to the question is yes. You are identical to the animal. Or rather, when each of you produce that argument, the answer is you are identical to the animal. Secondly, let's make the assumption that you're not identical to the animal. Let's make that as an assumption. Where does that take us? What does that leave us thinking? Well, what it seems to leave us thinking is this. You are where you are, and what kind of states do you have? Well, you have psychological states, you're thinking, you're talking, you're perceiving, you're acting, and that's something that you have. But if we ask, what psychological states, if any, does the animal where you are have? What's the answer to that question? Well, presumably, we all would say that the animal, the human animal where you are, itself perceives, guides itself around the world, finds food, talks. It seems to have exactly the same psychological properties that you have. Okay. But if you think that you and the animal are different things, you thereby end up in a position which holds that where you are, there are two entities, both having the same psychological properties, you and the animal. And that's, on the face of it, not what you're inclined to think. You're not inclined to think that there's a duality of subjects where you are. There's just one. And finally, this is the final little argument. The anchor on the debate is very much to do with the reference of the first person. What are you actually referring to when you use the word I? What is the reference of the first person? But if you're concentrating on that question, a basic question is, how come you have the capacity to refer to yourself? How is it that we all in this room are capable of referring to ourselves using the first person pronoun? Well, I think that an answer at a very general level has to be something like, that's one of those capacities that we have acquired through the evolutionary pathway out of which we emerged. Along this line, the capacity for first-person reference emerges and remains because it confers benefits on the animals that have it. Right? It's like lots of capacities that animals have. It's there because of the benefits over time that they acquire, given that it emerges for them. Now, if that very general hypothesis is correct, what does that imply about self-reference and the use of the word I? Well, on the face of it, that goes along with the idea that the role of I is for the animal to pick itself out and talk about itself, and maybe to employ in thinking about itself too. Because when you're thinking about evolution, the benefits are ones which the animal into which these things have emerged, the benefits acquired by the animal. So on the face of it, the existence of first-person thought is to be explained by benefits it brings to the animals which have it, which seems to imply it's the animals that are doing the self-referring. So those are three little arguments which put some pressure on supposing there's an identity between yourself and the animal. Anyway, so that's on the other side. There are all the counterexamples and dissociation problems on the other side. But now, let me just finish with death. Yes, I'll finish with death in 2 minutes. And I mean, I'm finishing with death partly because I wanted to develop the idea that philosophical reflections can, in a sense, engage with thinking about things that are of ordinary concern to us in the way that death is. And what I've been struck by recently is the emergence of a certain kind of style of thinking about death, which is called transhumanism. Okay, and it's primarily an American movement, but not solely. Okay? And roughly it starts with a problem. And the problem is death. Death is a problem. Why is death a problem? Well, death is a problem because we don't want to have it, right? It's kind of undesirable. We don't want to die. So it poses a problem because on the face of it, it looks like it's going to happen, but we don't want it to happen, so that's a problem. And the problem brings with it a solution, right? The solution is, as long as you remain human, you are going to die, because human animals die. Why is an interesting question, but they do. So if you don't want to die, and you recognize that human animals die, you can only escape death by becoming non-human, right? You can transcend your human nature. That's what transhumanism is about. Okay, how can you do that? The answer is, now at this point the answer is not 100% clear, but it involves the idea that you could become a computer, you can be taken into a computer, or you can become a robot, or something of this technically advanced sort. You can do that. Now that's the ultimate solution. If you're thinking along these lines, there is what might be called the interim problem. And that is, well, we don't know how to do it now. So in order to overcome the interim problem, you have to devise a method of storing yourself so that when the technology for transforming yourself into something like a computer becomes available, you will still be around and it can happen to you. And that means you basically preserve yourself cryogenically in some sort of vat. Okay, that's the solution to the interim problem. Very expensive and pretty ghastly, but there we are. That is what you have to do. Okay, now this is a movement in kind of popular thinking which has a number of very powerful supporters, amongst very distinguished supporters. How does it relate to what I've been talking about? Well, the very simple thought I have is if the arguments I was putting forward look as if they might be in the right direction, that basically our fundamental nature is that we are animals, human animals. Okay. It doesn't look as if there's any possible way for you to transform yourself into something else, because if what you are is a human being, a human animal, whatever processes linking you and things to do with you to computers there could possibly be are processes which cannot transport you into that new domain, right? Because what you are is an animal. Now, therefore, the kind of implication is that insofar as death is a problem for human beings and for animals, the solution, it doesn't really make sense to adopt a transhumanist solution to that problem. We're stuck with the problem and have to reflect on it in some other way. Okay, well, that is the end.